My name is Clara Mitchell. I am 34 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my parents never saw me as a daughter, but as their unpaid cook, their personal chef trapped inside a house that smelled of polished silverware and burned expectations. While my younger brother Daniel lived like a prince wearing tailored suits bought with my parents' money and strutting through parties as if he owned the world, I was kept in the kitchen, sleeves, rolled up burns on my arms from endless hours over boiling pots. Every holiday, every birthday, every family gathering turned into another shift in a restaurant I never signed up for. I was the invisible worker in my own home. The breaking point came on Christmas Eve last year. I was folding a blouse in my small Boston apartment when my phone lit up with the familiar name that always sent a cold rush through my body. Mom, I already knew this was not a call of love or care. Her voice was sharp, commanding the kind that tolerated no hesitation. Clara, cancel whatever silly plans you have, she ordered. Tomorrow, Daniel is hosting 30 very important guests at the house. Executives, investors, real people who matter. You will come by noon and prepare the entire feast. 7 main courses, 15 sides, 3 desserts. We have already promised everyone that you would handle it. You don't want to embarrass us, do you? I remember gripping my phone so tightly I thought the glass would crack. They had not even asked. They never asked. They assumed I would obey, like always. But what she did not know was that the very next morning I was scheduled to fly to Miami for the most important meeting of my career. A meeting with Evelyn Parker, the CEO of an international hotel chain. The kind of contract that could change not only my life, but the lives of the 60 employees who trusted me to lead them. In that moment, standing in my quiet apartment with my packed suitcase beside me and my mother barking orders like I was staff, I felt the years of humiliation and silence harden into something else entirely. Rage, resolve. I was no longer the family's maid. I was a CEO. And soon, the very CEO they wanted to impress at that Christmas party would be shaking my hand and calling me boss. Before I take you deeper into what happened that night, I want to pause for a moment. Stories like mine are not just about one family. They are about patterns of silence and disrespect that many people endure for years. If you're watching this, you might have lived through moments where you were treated as less, where your worth was invisible to the very people who should have lifted you up. I read every single comment, and I would love to know where you are watching from and what time it is right now. Share it below because your voice matters, and you might discover you are not alone in your experience. If stories about toxic families, justice, and quiet revenge speak to you, then consider subscribing because this channel is building a community of people who refuse to stay small, who refuse to keep dimming their light just to make others comfortable. Now let me take you back not just to that Christmas Eve, but to the long years that came before it. Years that shaped me into the woman who finally said no. I grew up in a house where appearances mattered more than truth. My parents, Margaret and Richard Mitchell, lived in a grand colonial home in Connecticut. White columns out front, manicured lawns that made neighbors envy us. From the outside, we looked like the perfect family, but behind the polished doors, there was a hierarchy carved deep into our daily lives. My younger brother Daniel was the golden child. From the moment he was born, every resource, every ounce of attention, every sacrifice was poured into him. He had the largest bedroom freshly renovated into a sleek suite with a private bathroom and a flat screen on the wall before he was even 15. He was given the newest car the week he turned 16, a brand new BMW with a bow on top, while I was told to be grateful for the 10-year-old Toyota that barely survived the winter. My trophies, my books, the traces of my life were boxed up and shoved into the basement to make room for Daniel's expanding wardrobe. When I asked why my mother's voice was sweet with poison, Daniel needs the space, Clara. You'll understand one day. You're not as visible as him, and that's okay. You're better off behind the scenes. Behind the scenes became my prison. From the time I was 12, I was expected to cook. At first, it was little things setting the table, chopping vegetables. But by the time I was 15, I was handling entire Thanksgiving dinners for 20 relatives. While Daniel entertained guests with jokes and piano recitals, I was elbow deep in dishes, my hands raw from scalding water, my hair smelling of grease. Once, when I burned myself on the oven rack and cried out, my mother slapped me on the shoulder. Don't be dramatic, Clara. Pain makes you stronger. At family parties, introductions were brutal. This is our successful son, Daniel, father would beam. He's destined for greatness in business. And this, oh, Clara's here too. She helps out in the kitchen. I can still feel the sting of that word helps out. To them, I was not a person, not a daughter, but labor to be used. The worst came at Daniel's high school graduation party. 200 guests filled our backyard. I had spent 14 hours preparing appetizers, trays upon trays of delicate bites arranged perfectly. When a guest asked what I did, my mother laughed lightly, brushing off the question. Clara doesn't have Daniel's charm, but she's very handy in the kitchen. Handy, as if I were a tool, not a human being. Daniel smirked at me, soaking in the adoration while I hid in the shadows. And then there was the violence, subtle at first, then more overt. Daniel discovered early that he could push me without consequence. One summer evening, as I carried a pot of boiling pasta, he blocked my way and shoved me back just enough for the water to splash against my wrist. I screamed in pain, red blisters rising instantly. My mother rushed in, saw me crying, and snapped, Clara, stop being clumsy. Look what you've done to your brother's shirt. She wiped Daniel's sleeve while ignoring my burn. That night, I sat alone in my room with a cold towel wrapped around my wrist, and I learned that pain in our house was never acknowledged unless it belonged to Daniel. Gaslighting became the air I breathed. When I protested being treated like a servant, my mother's eyes would narrow, her voice dripping with condescension. We're only hard on you because we love you, Clara. If we didn't care, we wouldn't push you so much. Without us, you'd be nothing. Over time, I began to doubt myself. Maybe I was nothing. Maybe I was meant to stay small. But something inside me refused to die. I buried myself in work outside that house, taking jobs in diners and cafes, saving every tip, learning every trick of the trade. I studied hospitality management in night classes, while my family mocked me. Are you still wasting time with that little cooking hobby, my father asked once? You'll never be more than a line cook, but at least Daniel is building real connections. Real connections meant endless nights at country clubs, golf trips, networking dinners, all funded by my parents, all revolving around Daniel's inflated image. He called himself an entrepreneur, but his only venture was burning through my parents' money. The contrast grew sharper as I got older. By my mid-20s, while Daniel was crashing cars and failing investments, I was quietly learning the business side of catering. I took the $5,000 I had saved from waiting tables and invested it into launching Aurora Catering and Events. I didn't tell anyone in my family. Why would I? They would have laughed, dismissed it as fantasy. So I worked in silence. I built connections with hotels, luxury resorts, corporations. I hired staff who were like me, overlooked, underestimated, but talented. We grew slowly, steadily. By 30, I had 3 locations: Boston, New York, and Miami. 60 employees, each one loyal, because I treated them with the respect I never received at home. My proudest moment was landing a contract to cater a tech summit for 500 guests. My team executed flawlessly, and the CEO of the hosting company praised us publicly. That night, while my employees celebrated, I sat alone realizing I could never tell my family. If I shared that victory, my mother would only sneer and shift the spotlight back to Daniel. The deeper I built my empire, the more invisible I became to them. At one family dinner, my father introduced Daniel as the success story, and then added with a chuckle, Clara's between jobs again, but she makes a decent roast. That very morning, I had signed a $500,000 contract. Between jobs, they called it. Between recognition and reality, there was a canyon. I carried that canyon inside me, smiling politely while my family degraded me, going home to contracts clients in a thriving business they had no clue existed. One summer, I came home to discover my old bedroom had been converted entirely into Daniel's walk-in closet. My trophies, my books, the small evidence of my achievements stuffed into boxes in the basement. Margaret's explanation was simple. Daniel's career requires a strong image. He needs the space. Image was everything to them. Substance was nothing. And me, I was nothing in their eyes. Yet in boardrooms across the country, CEOs were learning my name. Evelyn Parker, CEO of Horizon International Hotels, had reached out personally after hearing about our flawless execution at the Tech Summit. She wanted to discuss a long-term partnership, an exclusive $3 million catering contract for her chain's luxury properties. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, the kind of deal that could elevate Aurora from regional to national power. We had been exchanging emails for weeks, finalizing details preparing to sign in Miami the day after Christmas. My assistant had even whispered that Evelyn admired how I built everything without family money or connections. If only she knew how literal that was. But at home, nothing had changed. The gaslighting continued. One night over dinner, Margaret smirked when I mentioned traveling for work. Work, she scoffed. You call your little cooking errands work. Daniel is meeting real executives, Clara. That's what matters. I looked across the table at Daniel, who was sipping expensive wine purchased by my father, his tie loose, his smile smug. He winked at me as if to say, "You'll never catch up." That was the role I was cast in Servant Scapegoat Invisible. Until that Christmas Eve when the script finally tore apart. What my family never saw, what they never even bothered to ask about, was the empire I had been quietly building in the shadows of their contempt. While they reduced me to a kitchen hand, I was in boardrooms signing contracts. While Daniel was parading around in cars bought by our father, I was hiring staff and managing payrolls. I founded Aurora Catering and Events 5 years ago, with nothing but $5,000 saved from endless shifts waiting tables. I worked double nights, slept 3 hours, reinvested every cent. The company started with a single rented kitchen in Boston and 2 employees who believed in me. From there, we grew because I refused to settle. I courted clients no one else wanted, the tough gigs with impossible menus and ridiculous deadlines. We nailed them. We built a reputation for excellence and reliability, the very qualities my own family said I lacked. By the time I turned 30, Aurora had 3 fully operational branches in Boston, New York, and Miami, 60 employees, a fleet of trucks, a client list that included law firms, hospitals, tech companies, and even a senator's fundraising gala. But to my parents, I was still their maid. They never asked how I afforded my apartment in Boston, how I drove a car newer than Daniel's last wreck. They assumed I was living on scraps or secret handouts. In reality, my revenue for the last fiscal year had crossed $7 million. I had an operations manager, James, who often told me, "Clara, you work harder than anyone I know." My head chef, Maria, cried the day she put a down payment on her first home, all because of the stability our company gave her. These people respected me, depended on me. They called me boss with pride. Not once did my own family use that word. The greatest irony was that while my mother bragged about Daniel meeting investors and executives, my inbox was filled with messages from actual power players. None more important than Evelyn Parker. She was the CEO of Horizon International Hotels, a woman whose reputation in hospitality was legendary. When her assistant reached out after hearing about our flawless execution of the Boston Tech Summit, I almost dropped my phone. She wanted to meet me, not my team, not my chef's me. She said she admired entrepreneurs who built from nothing, especially those who had no family backing. The timing could not have been more perfect. For weeks, we exchanged documents, proposals, schedules. The plan was to meet in Miami on December 26th to finalize a $3 million exclusive contract to provide catering for Horizon's luxury properties in Florida. My entire staff buzzed with excitement. Maria whispered, "If this goes through, I can finally hire the pastry team we've been dreaming of." James calculated how many more schools his kids could choose from. This contract was not just about me. It was about the livelihoods of 60 people. The pressure was immense, but it was the kind of pressure that fueled me. Every night I checked the flight confirmation to Miami. Every morning I reread Evelyn's emails, reminding me how crucial my presence was. She insisted on meeting the founder herself. "It has to be you, Clara. I only partner with CEOs who are hands-on." That was the clause she added to the contract CEO presence required at all strategic planning sessions. I smiled when I read it because, for once, being present as myself was not a liability. It was the key. Meanwhile, my family plotted my next humiliation. On December 23rd, Margaret called with that same icy entitlement. Clara, cancel whatever nonsense you're doing. Daniel's Christmas Eve party is hosting 30 executives. These are real people, not your little clients. We promised them you would cook. Her words slid through me like knives. They had no idea that the very executives they were desperate to impress were beneath the caliber of my actual partners. They had no idea that Evelyn Parker herself, their dream guest, had already committed to meeting me the next morning in Miami. The contrast was staggering. At their table, I was invisible. At Evelyn's table, I was essential. When I hung up that call staring at my packed suitcase, I realized something monumental. For years, I had accepted their gaslighting, convinced myself that family came first, even when it destroyed me. But this time, the stakes were higher than my feelings. This time, 60 employees depended on me. If I caved to my mother's demands, if I stayed in Connecticut and played servant again, I would jeopardize everything. If I chose myself, I would finally step out of their narrative and into my truth. The choice was brutal but clear. My family had mistaken my silence for weakness. They were about to discover that silence was strategy. They would only understand who I had become when the world saw me not as their maid, but as the CEO whose signature carried millions. That Christmas Eve would split my life in two halves, the daughter they tried to crush and the woman who refused to bow. The morning of December 24th, I woke to a barrage of messages lighting up my phone, the kind of frantic flood only my family could unleash. First came my mother's email subject line urgent menu adjustments, listing 12 main courses, 15 side dishes, 3 desserts, and a note about using the Waterford crystal. Then came Daniel's text casual and cruel. Mom says you're on kitchen duty. Don't screw it up. I'll toss you $100 for your trouble. His arrogance was so ingrained that he thought of me as disposable labor, something he could rent for the evening. I stared at the messages, my jaw tight, and felt the old sickness of rage and resignation battling inside me. For years, I had folded under this pressure. I had canceled dates, skipped vacations, lost job opportunities because family came first. But that morning, with my suitcase packed for Miami and the contract waiting, something inside me snapped into steel. I called my mother back. She answered on the first ring. Finally, she barked, "I was starting to think you weren't taking this seriously." Margaret's tone was as cutting as ever, a command dressed as concern. I took a slow breath. "Mom, I can't do it." Silence crackled over the line before she hissed, "What do you mean you can't?" "We have 30 guests arriving. Executives, investors, Evelyn Parker herself. If you walk away from this, you will destroy Daniel's future." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone. "I have a business trip. I'm flying to Miami tonight." Her laugh was sharp and cruel. "Business. Don't be ridiculous. You don't have a real job, Clara. You cook. You'll always cook. This is family. Family comes before your silly errands." "No," I said, my voice shaking but steady. "Family comes first only when you need something from me. Otherwise, I don't exist." "How dare you?" she snapped. "We kept you in this house, fed you, gave you a roof over your head. You owe us." The words landed like a whip, the same justification they had used for decades. "You owe us." I pressed my lips together and whispered, "I don't owe you servitude." My father's voice chimed in faintly from the background. "Clara, don't cause trouble, just help your brother." The old dynamic Richard passive, Margaret dictating, Daniel grinning on the sidelines. I had lived in that triangle of control for too long. I lifted my chin, though they couldn't see it. "I won't be there, Mom. I'm not your maid. If you leave, don't bother coming back." The threat hung heavy, a familiar weapon they had wielded since I was a teenager. Usually it worked. Usually it made me crumble. But this time I felt the opposite. Relief. "Then I guess this is goodbye," I said. Her scream nearly shattered the speaker. "You ungrateful girl, you're nothing without us." I hung up. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from release. Within minutes, my phone exploded again, this time with Daniel's fury. What the hell did you do? Mom's having a meltdown. Get over here now. I stared at his messages, then typed back 4 words. I'm not coming, Daniel. He responded with a stream of insults. You're pathetic. You're selfish. You'll ruin everything. You'll regret this. Then the last one, raw and violent. If you walk away, you're dead to us. I set the phone down on my counter next to the note I had scribbled with numbers of emergency catering companies. Despite everything, I wasn't cruel enough to leave them entirely stranded. If they wanted, they could call someone else. But I wasn't going to be their scapegoat anymore. I walked to the mirror, adjusted my blazer, and whispered to my reflection, "You're not their maid. You're the boss." By afternoon, the threats escalated. My father left a voicemail begging me to reconsider. "Your mother is frantic. She's calling every restaurant in town. Just come home." My mother sent an email with the subject line, "Final warning," full of accusations about how I was destroying Daniel's reputation. Daniel's texts turned darker. "You think you're better than us. You're nothing. No one will ever respect you." Gaslighting so familiar it almost lulled me, almost convinced me to cave. Almost. But then I opened my inbox and saw Evelyn's confirmation. "Looking forward to our meeting tomorrow, Clara. Your leadership is exactly what Horizon needs." I read it twice, then a third time until the words burned into me. Your leadership. My leadership. Not my servitude. I picked up my phone one last time and texted my mother. "I will not be there tonight. I will be on a plane. Do not contact me again unless it is with respect." Then I turned it off, slipped it into my purse, and focused on the path ahead. That night, as I zipped up my suitcase, I knew the consequences would be brutal. But I also knew that for the first time in 34 years, I had chosen myself over their control. And that was worth any price. While I packed my suitcase and set out my passport for the flight to Miami, chaos erupted in Connecticut. My phone was off, but later I would see the flood of messages that painted the entire picture with cruel clarity. By 6 o'clock that evening, my parents' grand colonial home glittered with Christmas lights strung along the eaves, the driveway filled with luxury cars, the front hall buzzing with the chatter of 30 carefully chosen guests. Margaret floated from room to room, her voice shrill as she assured everyone that dinner would be ready any moment, prepared personally by her daughter Clara, the family's talented cook. They believed she was praising me, but I knew the truth. Her words dripped with the same patronizing venom as always reducing me to a servant even in absentia. The guests were no ordinary neighbors. They were lawyers, investment bankers, potential donors to Daniel's latest business fantasy, and most importantly, Evelyn Parker, the CEO of Horizon International Hotels. Evelyn had been invited because Margaret thought impressing her would open doors for Daniel's supposed career in hospitality PR. Margaret bragged all week about the feast her daughter would prepare, the multiple courses, the perfect pairings. She even told people Clara may not be good at much else, but she can cook like a professional. So when 7 o'clock rolled around, and the dining room table gleamed with polished silverware and Waterford crystal, but not a single dish panic began to spread. Margaret stormed into the kitchen, expecting me only to find bare counters and an empty refrigerator stocked with nothing but milk, eggs, and leftover takeout. She shrieked at Richard to call every restaurant in a 50-mile radius. Daniel slammed doors, swore under his breath, accused Margaret of not checking with me sooner. Guests grew restless in the living room, sipping champagne and whispering. The humiliation spread like smoke. By 7:15, Evelyn Parker herself arrived, stepping gracefully into the room, in a navy suit, her eyes sharp as she scanned the surroundings. Margaret hurried to her side, voice trembling. "Welcome, welcome, Evelyn. The meal will be served shortly." Evelyn nodded politely, but glanced toward the kitchen where the silence was deafening. At 7:30, the truth could no longer be hidden. No roast, no turkey, no sides, nothing. Margaret's voice cracked as she instructed Daniel to order whatever he could. Daniel, red-faced, dialed furiously, only to discover that every fine restaurant was closed on Christmas Eve. In desperation, he ordered pizza from Domino's and Papa John's. By 8 o'clock, the smell of cheap tomato sauce and cardboard crust filled the house, clashing with the gleam of silver candelabras and crystal goblets. Guests exchanged horrified looks as paper boxes were carried into the dining room, and their contents placed on the finest china. Pizza slices sagged under the weight of grease, served beside expensive wines Margaret had boasted about for weeks. The sight was grotesque comedy and tragedy intertwined. Evelyn Parker watched with cool detachment, sipping her champagne, her expression unreadable. When Margaret tried to laugh it off, insisting her older daughter had sabotaged the evening by abandoning her duty, Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Your daughter was supposed to cook all of this by herself," she asked evenly for 30 guests. Margaret rushed to defend herself. "She's unreliable. She's always been unstable, but she promised Evelyn. She promised." Guests whispered behind their hands some stifling laughter, others shaking their heads. By 8:30, half the room had made excuses and left. Evelyn departed quietly not long after citing another engagement. Daniel attempted to pitch her his PR services between bites of lukewarm pizza, but she dismissed him with a polite smile and walked out into the cold night. By 9 o'clock, the once glittering party had dissolved into a wreckage of grease-stained napkins and humiliation. Margaret collapsed into a chair, her face pale, muttering curses about me. Richard tried to comfort her, but even he looked defeated, aware of the spectacle that would become gossip at the country club for years. Daniel paced angrily, firing off messages to me that would later fill my phone screen with accusations. "You ruined us. You embarrassed us." Evelyn left. Everyone left. "This is your fault." But as they scrambled in the ruins of their vanity, I was boarding a plane at JFK, settling into my seat with a calmness I had never known. The hum of the engines drowned out the noise of their chaos. Below me, Connecticut lights blurred into darkness. They had chosen to paint me as their servant, and in the moment when it mattered most, they discovered what life was like without the servant they took for granted. For the first time in my life, their downfall was not my burden to carry. It was theirs alone. The next morning, the Florida sun spilled across the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Horizon Resort in Miami as I adjusted my blazer and prepared for the meeting that would define my career. I had slept only a few hours, but it was the kind of restless anticipation that comes when everything is at stake. At 7 p.m. that evening, I entered the private dining room, where Evelyn Parker and her executive team were gathering for the pre-contract dinner. The room gleamed with modern elegance, white linen draped over long tables, the scent of orchids faint in the air. My portfolio rested in my hands, but my pulse was steady. I had rehearsed every response, every detail of the proposal. What I had not rehearsed was the story Evelyn carried with her. "Clara," she greeted me warmly, though her eyes held the fatigue of a long journey. "I must apologize for being late. I was coming straight from the most bizarre Christmas Eve party in Connecticut." My breath caught, but my expression stayed composed. "Oh, what happened?" I asked, lightly. She shook her head with a mixture of amusement and disgust. "I was invited to what was supposed to be an elegant dinner at the Sullivan, no excuse me, the Mitchell household. Margaret Mitchell promised a lavish meal prepared by her daughter. Instead, we arrived to find chaos. No food prepared, not even a salad. Guests milling about desperate phone calls and then boxes of pizza delivered onto fine crystal." She laughed softly. "I thought I had seen unprofessional events before, but this was legendary." I nodded, keeping my hands still, though inside me a storm raged. Evelyn continued. "And the strangest part was how the hostess spent the entire evening disparaging her older daughter. She called her unreliable, unstable, a disappointment. I have never heard a mother speak that way about her own child in front of strangers. It was shocking." My throat tightened, but I forced my voice calm. That must have been difficult to witness. She studied me for a moment, then reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "Someone sent me a photo," she said, showing me the screen. There was my mother, red-faced, surrounded by pizza boxes piled on the mahogany table. Daniel hovered nearby, gesturing wildly, while guests tried to hide their amusement. My entire family's humiliation captured in a single frame. Evelyn set the phone down and leaned forward. "Tell me, Clara, is Margaret Mitchell your mother?" For a moment the room went silent, the air thick. I could hear the ticking of my own heartbeat. Then I nodded. "Yes." Her brows rose. "And you are the daughter she claimed was unstable, unreliable, unable to hold a job." Yes, I said again. But this time my voice carried steel. But she was wrong. I am the CEO of Aurora Catering and Events. This contract, this dinner, everything you see here, it is my work. Evelyn blinked, then leaned back slowly, laughter spilling out genuine and incredulous. Oh my God, she exclaimed, clapping her hands once. The very woman your family mocked as a failure is the one I have been trying to sign for 2 years. She turned to her executives. Gentlemen, we may be about to sign the most interesting contract of our careers. They chuckled, but the respect in their eyes was unmistakable. One of them, James, spoke carefully. Just to clarify, your family truly has no idea that you run a multi-million-dollar company. None, I answered. They believe I am unemployed living off scraps, barely surviving. They think of me as their maid. Evelyn shook her head, her expression shifting from amusement to admiration. That is extraordinary. She lifted her phone again and typed my name into Google. The results populated instantly, a profile in Hospitality Weekly photos, of me shaking hands with governors, an announcement of our expansion into Miami. She turned the screen to her team. Look at this. The daughter they dismissed has been building an empire right under their noses. And then, as if fate itself had scripted the moment, Evelyn's assistant rushed in carrying an iPad. Ms. Parker, you'll want to see this, he said breathlessly. Forbes just announced their 40 under 40 cover story for tomorrow. He projected the screen onto the wall. And there I was, my professional headshot dominating the cover. The headline blazing, "From Invisible to Invaluable: How Clara Mitchell Built a Catering Empire Without a Dollar of Family Money." The room fell silent, then erupted with laughter and applause. Evelyn's eyes sparkled as she read aloud. Clara Mitchell, 34, founded Aurora Catering with $5,000 saved from waiting tables and built it into a multi-million-dollar enterprise with 3 branches and 60 employees. She deliberately avoided family money and connections to prove success can be earned without privilege. She set the iPad down and looked at me, her voice soft but firm. Your family still doesn't know, do they? They will, I replied when everyone else does. Evelyn stood pacing toward the window, then turned back with a grin. I cannot resist, she said. She dialed a number on her phone pressed speaker and waited. On the third ring, Margaret's voice crackled through, brittle and panicked. Evelyn, please, last night was a disaster. But it wasn't my fault. My daughter sabotaged us. Evelyn's smile was sharp. Margaret, I wanted to thank you for the evening. It was certainly unforgettable. Margaret rushed to explain. She is unstable, Evelyn. She ruins everything. I promise it won't happen again. Evelyn's eyes locked on mine as she delivered the blow. I understand, Margaret. Fortunately, I have already signed a contract with your daughter, Clara Mitchell, CEO of Aurora Catering. The silence that followed was electric. On the other end, Margaret gasped like the air had been ripped from her lungs. Then the line went dead. My phone, still on silent, began buzzing furiously, dozens of missed calls piling up in seconds. Evelyn hung up, slid her phone back into her purse, and extended her hand across the table. Ms. Mitchell, let's make this official. With steady hands, I signed my name on the $3 million contract while champagne was poured. My family's voices screamed on my phone, but I ignored them. The only voices that mattered were in that room, calling me what my family never had. Boss. The ink on the contract was barely dry when my phone began vibrating nonstop, a storm of missed calls and frantic messages flashing across the screen. Margaret left voicemails dripping with venom. How could you do this to us, Clara? Evelyn humiliated me in front of everyone. Do you have any idea what you've destroyed? Daniel's texts were worse, furious tirades blaming me for his ruined reputation, calling me selfish, pathetic, heartless. Even my father tried to appeal to guilt. Clara, please, your mother fainted when Evelyn told her the truth. Call us back, fix this. But there was nothing left to fix. The damage had already spread like wildfire through their carefully curated social circle. Within 24 hours, gossip at the country club painted a vivid picture. Margaret Mitchell, who prided herself on flawless hosting, had served delivery pizza on Waterford Crystal. The story traveled faster than wine could be poured. By the second day, Daniel's fledgling PR venture lost its biggest client, who quietly cited concerns about professionalism. Another withdrew within hours. His golden image tarnished overnight, leaving him pacing his condo, screaming into his phone. Margaret fared no better. She was discreetly asked to step down from the charity board she had clung to for decades, the directors murmuring about reputational risk. She called me sobbing, not with apology, but with outrage. "They think I am a fraud," she wailed. "Do you know what that means for me?" I listened in silence, then hung up. Richard, usually silent, finally called late one night. His voice trembled. "Clara, I knew. I saw Aurora's business registration years ago when some mail arrived by mistake. I should have spoken up, but it was easier to let your mother's story stand." Shame thickened his words. "I am sorry." I wanted to feel something at his confession, but I was empty. It was too late for apologies whispered in the dark. Meanwhile, my own world ignited in the best way. The Forbes cover story went live at midnight, and within hours my inbox flooded with congratulations. Old clients renewed contracts, new ones begged for space on our calendar. Television producers called about interviews. Hospitality conferences wanted me as keynote. My staff celebrated like it was New Year's Eve, popping champagne, sending me videos of their families cheering. Maria hugged me with tears in her eyes. "You showed them, Clara. You showed all of us that we don't have to stay small." Evelyn Parker herself became my most vocal champion, introducing me to her network with a gleam of satisfaction. At dinners, she told the story of the infamous Christmas Eve pizza party, never cruelly, but with a lesson attached. Imagine, she would say, having a golden goose in your house and treating it like a kitchen hand. 3 more contracts worth $10 million combined came directly from her introductions. For the first time, I felt seen not as a servant, but as a leader. Yet back in Connecticut, the Mitchell name collapsed. Margaret avoided public events, hiding behind drawn curtains. Daniel tried to spin narratives online, but screenshots of pizza boxes on fine china went viral attached to mocking captions. One read, "5-star hosting Papa John's edition." Richard's golf buddies teased him mercilessly, asking how he could ignore his own daughter's success while worshiping a son who failed upward. I did not have to lift a finger. Justice was unfolding all on its own. Still, the messages kept coming. Margaret begged, then threatened, then begged again. Daniel demanded money, claiming I owed the family for my success. Richard pleaded for peace. Through it all, I remained silent. Success was my answer. Boundaries were my shield. 6 months later, when the noise finally dulled, I agreed to meet them at a quiet restaurant in Boston. The table between us was heavy with unspoken years. They looked smaller than I remembered. Margaret's imperious posture was gone, her hands fidgeting. Daniel's smugness had curdled into desperation. Richard seemed older, his eyes tired. Before anyone could speak, I set down a piece of paper. "These are my terms." They leaned in. 1, equal respect or no contact. 2, no more servant treatment ever. 3, public acknowledgement of my success. 4, genuine apology, not just words. 5, therapy, family and individual, non-negotiable. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Clara, we've lost everything. My reputation, Daniel's clients." "That's not my responsibility," I said calmly. Daniel muttered, "You were always better, but Mom made me feel special by making you small." It was sick. His voice cracked. "I'm in therapy now." The honesty startled me. Margaret reached across the table, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry, not just for Christmas Eve, but for all the years I made you feel invisible. I turned you into a servant because I couldn't bear the thought of you surpassing me." I studied their faces, then spoke slowly. "I'll consider rebuilding, but know this, I will never return to being your maid. If we rebuild, it is as equals." They nodded. Margaret even managed a faint smile when I added, "And if you ever want Aurora to cater anything, you will pay full price." For the first time in years, she laughed softly and whispered, "Fair." That night, I returned to my own apartment, the one overlooking the Charles River, and stood by the window as the city lights flickered. My phone buzzed with messages from staff updating me on new inquiries. One email subject line caught my eye: Harvard Business School invitation. They wanted me to speak on building success without family approval. I smiled, feeling the full weight of how far I had come. My family's downfall was not my triumph. My triumph was my own. But their downfall was proof of what happens when you underestimate the person you've tried to silence. 3 months after that dinner in Boston, I hosted a gathering of my own. Not for my family, but for the people who had walked with me through the shadows and into the light, my employees, my clients, my friends. We rented a rooftop space in downtown Miami, overlooking the ocean's string lights swaying in the warm breeze. Maria stood beside me as guests toasted the company's expansion into Los Angeles. James handed me a printed report showing record profits and a waiting list for our services stretching 8 months into the future. For once, I was not in a kitchen, sleeves rolled up invisible. I was at the center, celebrated not for what I could cook, but for what I had built. The next morning, as the sun rose pink over the Atlantic, I sat with a cup of coffee and reread the Harvard Business School invitation. The title of the lecture made me smile: Building Success Without Permission, Creating Your Own Path in Hospitality. I knew exactly what I would say. I would tell the students about the girl forced into a kitchen, at 12 slapped for crying when she burned her wrist, called clumsy, called invisible. I would tell them how gaslighting corrodes your sense of self, how silence becomes a cage. And then I would tell them that silence can also be strategy, that choosing when to speak, when to reveal, when to draw boundaries is power. When I finally stood before that audience, weeks later looking out at eager faces, I spoke the words that had crystallized in me through every humiliation and every victory. Success doesn't need family approval. Respect is non-negotiable. The applause that followed was different from any I had heard before. It wasn't pity. It wasn't forced. It was recognition. Later that night, as I walked through the quiet streets of Boston on a business trip, I passed my parents' old country club. Laughter spilled from the windows, but I knew the whispers inside had changed. My mother, once queen of that circle, was now a cautionary tale. My brother, once paraded as the prodigy, was spoken of as a failure who lived off borrowed time. And me, the invisible daughter, had become the headline, the keynote, the cover story. I felt no triumph in their loss, only clarity. They had written me as a servant in their play. I had written myself as the author of my own story. Months turned into a year, and though my parents occasionally sent messages asking for reconciliation, I responded with the same boundary I had laid down in Boston: respect or nothing. Daniel's therapy continued, and one day he sent a message I did not expect. Thank you for drawing the line. Without it, I never would have seen the truth. I didn't reply, but I felt a small shift inside me. Healing was possible, but only with accountability. On the anniversary of that disastrous Christmas Eve, I lit a single candle in my apartment, not for them, but for me. A symbol of survival, of self-respect, of the quiet fire that had carried me through years of gaslighting and control. I poured a glass of wine, raised it to the night sky, and whispered, I am not your maid. I am not your scapegoat. I am the boss of my own life. To anyone listening now, if you have ever been made to feel invisible in your own family, if you have been forced into a role you never chose, know this: you are not alone. You are not worthless. You do not need permission to shine. The people who try to keep you small will eventually drown in the consequences of their own blindness. Your job is not to save them from it. Your job is to save yourself. That was the lesson I carried from the kitchen of my childhood to the boardroom of my future. And every morning when I look in the mirror, I remind myself Clara Mitchell, CEO of Aurora Catering and Events, not the family's personal chef. Never again.